In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how to do texture baking for beginners. So there are many reasons why you might want to bake your material to texture maps in Blender. You might want to import your 3D model with your material into a game engine, or you also might want to use it in a different 3D software. Or you also might want to upload your 3D model with the material to Sketchfab. Or your material may not work in a different rendering engine, like maybe you've created a material in Cycles Render, but then you want to switch it over to Blender Eevee and have the same look. Or maybe your material is just very complex and you want to bake the textures so that the performance is better. So there are many reasons why you might want to bake your materials out to texture maps in Blender. So that's what I'm going to show you how to do in this video. Now, probably the main reason why you'd want to bake your material out to texture maps is because you want to use it in a different 3D program or a game engine or Sketchfab. But you may be using some amount of procedural materials. Like for this material here, I am using a procedural Musgrave texture and also a procedural noise texture, and these are procedural textures in Blender shader nodes. But because they're procedural, they only work in Blender, and so if you want to use this material in a game engine or a 3D software or another program, the procedural materials won't carry over to that other program. So you have to bake out the material to texture maps, and then you can use it in a different software. So that is a common reason why you'd want to bake out your textures to texture maps. And this material here is a procedural dirty metal material, and I have a tutorial on how to create this procedural dirty metal material. So if you'd like to check that out, I will have the links in the description. And I'm going to be using this material as an example for the tutorial. And this procedural material is also available for purchase on my Gumroad store, and you can also get access to it on my Patreon page. And speaking of my Gumroad store and Patreon page, tutorials like these are made possible thanks to my Gumroad customers and my Patreon supporters and my members on the YouTube memberships. So if you'd like to help support me and this channel, I will have links in the description to my Gumroad and my Patreon and the YouTube memberships. Those are all really great ways to help support me and this channel. And if you find this video helpful and you'd like to give me a little tip, you can also use the super thanks feature here on YouTube, and I do appreciate your support. So in this tutorial, I will show you how to bake the 4 most common texture maps. And those are the color map, the metallic map, the roughness map, and the normal map. Now the color map, the roughness map, and the normal map are the most common ones, but I did also want to cover how to bake metallic maps because metallic maps are a pretty common material because you're going to use metallic maps for any material which is made out of metal. And when you're baking metallic maps, you do need to use a specific workflow because there are some common problems which can come up when baking metallic maps. And so in this video, I will show you how to properly bake metallic maps. And of course, if your material isn't using all of these maps, then you don't have to bake all of them. So if your object isn't made out of metal and you aren't using any metallic values, then you won't need to bake a metallic map. Or maybe you're just trying to bake a really simple material and the material is only using a color value, then in that case, you could just bake the color map. And also after this tutorial, if you'd like to learn more about texture baking and learn how to bake some more maps, like for instance displacement maps and emission maps and some other different maps, baking textures from one UV map to a different UV map, or baking multiple materials to a single texture map, if you'd like to learn any of those things, then you can check out my Blender texture baking tutorial playlist after you watch this video. Alright, so the first step to texture baking is we need to create an image to bake to. So I am in the shading tab right here, and so I have the 3D space here so I can preview the material, and I'm in the rendered view. And then right over here on this side, I have the shader editor. So in the shader editor, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for an image texture. And let's drop the image texture right here just above the principled shader. So we need to create an image that we can bake the textures to. So I'm going to click on the new button right here, and then on the name, I can just rename this to Dirty Metal. Now the width and height here is going to change the resolution of the texture, and on default it is 1024 by 1024, and that is the standard resolution for a 1K texture. For this material, I want to bake a 4K texture, so what I'm going to do is click and then drag down and then let go, and this way I can change both values at the same time. And I'm going to type in 4096. So 4096 by 4096 is the standard resolution for a 4K texture. But you can of course change this to whatever you want, whether you want to do like an 8K texture or just like a 6K texture or a 4K or even just like a 2K texture. You can just change this to whatever resolution you want to bake the textures to. Now for the color here, we can just leave this to fully black because the baking is going to bake over the image. And then I can just click on the OK button. So we have now created an image that we can bake to. Now we need to tell Blender how the 3D object is going to be placed on the 2D texture. And so to do this, we need to UV unwrap the object if it hasn't already been UV unwrapped. Now to do this, you could go over to the UV editing workspace, but I'm instead just going to click right up here when the crosshair appears, and I can click and drag down, and that's going to split the window. And then if I click right here to change the editor type, I can change this to the UV editor. And then I want to load in this image that we've added. So if you click right here on the drop down, you can just add the dirty metal. So this is the blank black image that we've created. And in the 3D space, if I press the tab key to go into edit mode, you can see that the default Suzanne head has already been UV unwrapped. So if your object already has a nice UV unwrap, you can just leave it how it is, but your object may not be UV unwrapped. So I'm going to show you how to do a basic UV unwrap for texture baking. So just press the tab key to go into edit mode and press the A key to make sure all of the vertices are selected. I'm now going to press the U button, and then I'm just going to use the Smart UV project. That'll work fine for texture baking. So I'm going to click on the Smart UV project, and then we do need a little bit of space in between the islands. So on the island margin right here, I'm going to turn this to a 0.002. So 0.002, and then click on OK. And so by using the Smart UV project, Blender is going to do the best job that it can to UV unwrap the object. And to preview this in full screen, I can hover my mouse over the UV editor, and then I can press Control Spacebar. That's going to go into full screen. So here is the UV editing of the object. Now if you zoom in here, if you zoom in closely, you can see there is some space in between all of the different UV islands. And so we definitely want some space, because if the UV islands are overlapping, then there will be problems when we do the texture baking and it won't look correct. So that is why I turned up the island margin to just a small amount, just to make sure all the islands do have a bit of space in between them and there's no overlapping. And this is just a quick and simple UV unwrap, but if you'd like to learn more about UV unwrapping in Blender, then you can check out my UV unwrapping for beginners tutorial. I'll have a link to that in the description. Now I do just want to double check that there isn't any overlapping. So I'm going to press the A key to deselect all the UV editing, and then I can click on select, and I'm going to click on select overlap. And you can see there are a few things which are overlapping, so we can fix these, and this is actually really easy to fix. So what I'm going to do is click right up here, and this is going to go to the face select mode. You can also just click on the 3 button on the top of your keyboard. And then I'm just going to zoom in here, and I can just select this face, and I just want to move this face out into a free area. So I'm going to press the V key, and the V key is going to rip the faces, and so it's going to separate it into its own island. And then I can click to place it there, and if you want to move it again, you can press the G key and then move this around and then just place it. So I can now press the A key to deselect everything, and then I can click on select, and I'm going to click on select overlap again. So I can just zoom in here and select this face, and I can press the V key, that'll rip the faces so it's its own island, and I can just stick it somewhere here in kind of a free area. And if you just have a few UV islands, you can also scale the UV islands up. So if the UV islands are bigger, then they're going to be able to use more of the texture space. And so if you can scale some of the UV islands up so it actually has more pixels, and that way the final texture maps will be higher quality because they're using more of the pixels. And then once again, select and select overlap, and there's just one more here. So just select this face, I can press the V key to rip the faces, bring it over here, and I could also scale it up a bit. Alright, so I can click on the back to previous, or I can press Control Spacebar to minimize that. So we now have a decent UV unwrap for the texture baking. And again, if you'd like to learn the basics of UV unwrapping in Blender, then definitely check out my UV unwrapping for beginners tutorial. Now it may be that you also have some image textures in your material, and those image textures might be using the UV editing of the object. In this case, I am just using these procedural textures, and these procedural textures are using the object coordinates, so they're not actually using the UV mapping. But you may have some image textures in your material, and those image textures might be placed on the object using the UV editing. And so if your material does have some texture maps and you re-UV unwrap the object, then it might mess up the placement of those textures. And so if that's happening for your object, then you should check out my video on how to bake textures from one UV map to a different UV map. Alright, so I'm going to press the tab key to go back to object mode, and we can now go over the bake settings. So I'm going to click right up here to go to the render properties. Now right here on the render engine, it is important that you use the Cycles rendering engine, because the Eevee rendering engine doesn't actually support baking. So if your Blender file is in Eevee, you can totally use Eevee after you've baked the textures, but first you need to change the render engine over to Cycles, and then do the baking, and then once you're done with the baking, you can change it back to Blender Eevee. Now, if you open up the sampling tab right here, you can go to the render samples, and I like to use a render samples of just 10, because if you use less samples, then it's actually going to bake faster. But I found that just turning the samples to 10 won't affect the quality at all. The texture bake will still look fine, but the textures will bake much faster if the samples are turned down. So I just use a sample count of 10. Now, on the device here, I have a GPU in my computer, and my GPU renders a lot faster than my CPU, so if I use GPU, it's also going to bake faster. So the baking will work with both your CPU or your GPU if you have a GPU, so you can just use whichever one you would normally render your images with. So if you are in the Cycles rendering engine, you can scroll right down here and you will see that there is a baking tab. And I'm actually just going to click and then drag up and just drop it right up here so that it's higher up, and then I can click on this to open it up. So the first texture that I'm going to bake is the metallic map. And I especially want to cover the metallic map in this video because a lot of people can have problems with baking the metallic material. So in Blender, if you try to bake any textures with a metallic value, when you bake the texture is going to be fully black, and it's not going to bake correctly. And so if you are baking a material which consists of metal, you need to make sure the metallic value is turned all the way down to 0. Then you can bake all the textures, and then once the texture baking is finished, you can turn the metallic value back up to 1. Or if you have a texture which is plugged into the metallic value, you need to make sure that is unplugged and make sure the metallic value is turned to 0. Now back over here to the bake settings, if you click on the bake type, you can see that there are different options to bake to. So there's the diffuse one, and this one is used to bake the color maps. There's also roughness, and there's also normal, but there isn't actually any metallic value to bake to. So to bake the metallic map, I'm going to use the emission. So you can click on the emit, and that is short for the emission. Now to continue, I am going to be using Blender's built-in Node Wrangler add-on. So if you don't have the add-on enabled, you can just click on edit, and then you can go to the preferences, and then over there in the add-ons tab, you can search for a Node Wrangler and just check mark the Node Wrangler add-on. So the add-on is built into Blender, and I will show you how to use it in the video. So now that the Node Wrangler add-on is enabled, you can Control, Shift, and select different nodes, and that is going to add a viewer node, and it's going to preview the node on the object. Now, if you click right here on the arrow to open up the viewer node, you can see that the viewer node is actually an emission shader. So if we click on the bake button with the bake type set to emission, it's actually going to bake whatever the viewer node is previewing. So I can Control, Shift, and select this color ramp, and this color ramp here was going into the metallic value. So this texture here is telling it where it's going to be metallic and where it's not going to be metallic. So again, just make sure you turn the metallic value all the way to 0 on the principled shader, and then make sure you Control, Shift, and select the texture which is going into the metallic value. Now it may be that your material isn't using a texture in the metallic value, you might instead just be using a metallic value. And so if you're just using a single value, then instead of baking to a texture, we just want to bake to a color. So to do this, I'm going to press Shift A, I'm going to go here to the search, and I'm going to search for RGB, and we're just going to add the RGB node. And then real quick, I'm just going to Control, Shift, and select the principled shader again, and what I can do is I can plug the color into the metallic value. So now if you look at the material, if I turn the RGB all the way up to fully white, it is now a fully metallic material. But if I turn the RGB all the way to black, it's not going to be metallic at all. So if you have a material which is fully metal, you just want to turn the RGB all the way up to fully white, and then I just want to unplug the metallic value, so this metallic value is set to 0, and then you can Control, Shift, and select the RGB node, and that way the viewer node is going to preview a fully white color. In my case though, I am using this color ramp, so I'm going to Control, Shift, and select the color ramp. Alright, so there's just a few more things before we actually hit the bake button. Right here on the viewer node, you need to make sure that the strength is set to 1, because if the strength value is turned up higher than 1 or lower than 1, that's actually changing the value. So just make sure the strength is turned to 1 on the viewer node, but it should be set to a strength of 1 on default. Now the next thing that I need to do is turn the image texture's color space to non-color. So right here on the color space, make sure you turn this to non-color. And you want to do this before you bake the textures for any textures which aren't contributing to the base color. So for the color map, you're not going to do this, but for all of the other textures, you want to set this to non-color. Because if you don't set this to non-color, if you just leave it at the default of sRGB, then it's not going to bake the correct values, and so your final texture bake will look a bit different. And then the other thing you need to do is make sure the correct object is selected, and that way Blender will know what object it needs to bake. And then also here in the shader editor, you just need to make sure that the image texture is selected, and this way Blender will know what texture it's going to bake to. And then before I click on the bake button, I'm going to press Ctrl S, and that'll save the Blender file, just in case for some reason if Blender crashes, we won't lose our progress. And then I can click on the bake button. And so right down here, you can see that there is a progress bar, and how long it takes to bake will depend on the power of your computer. All right, and the baking is finished. So I'm going to press the tab key to go into edit mode, and then I'm going to press Control spacebar with my mouse hovered in the UV editor so I can see this in full screen. So you can see that Blender has baked the metallic values to the UV editing. And if I zoom in closely, you can really see the importance of having that space in between the islands, because if the islands were overlapping, then it would texture bake over the island, and so then there would be some problems and the bake wouldn't look correct. And you can also see that when it bakes, it gives a little space here in between the bake and the island, so that is important that you have some space there between the islands. So I'm just going to press Control spacebar again. Now if this island margin spacing is too big and you want to make it smaller, you can change that. So right over here on the bake settings, if you open up the margin, the default size right here is set to 16 pixels. And so most of the time I just leave this at the default, but if for some reason you want to make the margin smaller, you could turn this down. So for instance, I could just turn the margin size down to like an 8, and then again, make sure the object is selected, make sure that the image is selected, and then I can click on bake again. And it finished, and if I press the tab key to go into edit mode, you can now see that that island margin is much smaller. So an island margin of 8 is fine, so I'll just leave that to 8. Alright, so we now just need to save this image to our computer, because if we don't save this as an image file to our computer, then when we close Blender, Blender's not going to save the image data. So to save this to our computer, let's click on image, and then I can click on save as. And then I'm just going to save this in a folder on my computer, and I'm going to rename this to Dirty Metal Metallic, because this is the metallic texture, so I'm going to make sure to put the metallic at the end of the name there. And then if you want to, you can leave it as a PNG image, but I want to make the file size a bit smaller, so on the file format here, I can just change this to JPEG, and then I'll just turn the quality to 100. And then I can click on Save as Image. So that is how you bake the metallic map. Alright, so the next map is the color map. Now for the color map, I don't want to use the viewer node, so I'm just going to Control Shift and select the principled shader just to preview the principled shader again. Now as I mentioned earlier, if the metallic value is turned up, or if anything's plugged into the metallic value, then when you try to bake the textures, it's going to look fully black and it's not going to bake properly. So while we're baking the other textures, we need to keep the metallic value turned to 0. But then once we're done texture baking, we can turn the metallic value back up, or you can of course plug in the metallic texture. Now if you go right over here to the bake type, I want to bake the color map, so I'm going to change the bake type to diffuse. And so the diffuse is going to bake whatever is going into the base color of the principled shader. So if I Control Shift and select this color ramp, this is the color map, and so this is what it's going to bake. So I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now because this is the color map, this image is going to be going directly into the base color. So on the color space here, I want to change this back to the default, which is sRGB. Now if we go right back over here to the bake settings, there is this influence tab right here, and if I open this up, you can see there is direct, indirect, and color. Now if we leave the direct and indirect on, it's actually going to bake the lighting data as well, and in this case we don't want it to bake the lighting data, we just want it to bake the color, because we are going to use the lighting in the 3D scene to actually light the object. So on the contributions right here, we want to turn off the direct and indirect. We just want it to bake the color map. And then again, before you hit the bake button, make sure that the correct object is selected and make sure that the correct image texture is selected. And we're going to use the same image texture, so we are going to bake over this image texture, but then we'll save it to our computer as a different image texture. So make sure the object is selected, make sure the image is selected. This is set to diffuse here on the bake type, so I can just click on bake again. And it didn't take very long, and it is finished. So here we are, here is the color map. So then to save this map, you can click on image and you can click on save as. And I'm going to save this in the same folder with my other metallic map. But instead of calling it dirty metal metallic, I want to rename this to dirty metal color. And then again, I'll just save it as a JPEG image and I can click on save as. Alright, so it is now time to bake the roughness map. So to bake the roughness map over here on the bake settings, we want to click here on the diffuse and we want to change this to roughness. And then because the roughness values isn't going into the base color, we need the color space here to be set back to non-color. So then again, make sure that your object is selected, make sure that the texture is selected, we have the bake type set to roughness, and the color space is set to non-color, and then we can click on bake again. And it finished. So this is the roughness map. So it baked the data here, which was going into the roughness of the principled shader. So then to save this image, we can click on image and then click on save as. So again, I'm going to save the image in the same folder with my other textures, but I'm going to rename it to dirty metal roughness. So there we go, dirty metal roughness. And then I'll save it as a JPEG file and I will click on save as. All right, so the last one that we need to bake is the normal. So I have this noise texture going into the bump, and then this bump is going into the normal. So right here on the bake type, I can change this over to normal. And so if this is set to normal, it's going to bake whatever data is going into the normal of the principled shader. Now again, right here on the color space, we need to make sure this is set to non-color because the normal values isn't contributing to the base color. So then just make sure the object is selected, make sure that the image texture is selected. We have the bake type set to normal and it is set to non-color, and then I can click on bake again, and it is finished. So this data here is the normal data. So we can save this image just like the other images. So let's click on image and then click on save as. And then one more time, I'm going to save this in the folder with my other textures, but instead of it being called roughness, I'm going to save this to normal. So dirty metal normal, and then I will click on save as. And that is it. So the texture baking is now finished. So let's press Ctrl S again to save the Blender file. And then if you were using the Eevee rendering engine, you can now change this back to Eevee because we are done with the baking. So I'm now going to delete this material and we're going to add a new material, and then we're going to plug up all the textures. Now, just in case if there happens to be a problem with the texture baking and you want to go back to this material, I'm going to click on this little shield icon right here, and this is going to give the material a fake user. So this way, even if I delete this material from the object, it's going to keep this data in the Blender file. And that way, just in case if there's a problem with the baking, I can go back to this and rebake it. So now that I have this set as a fake user with the shield icon, I can click on the X button to get rid of this material. And then I can click on the new button to add a new material. And I can just rename this to like baked textures. So now we need to add in all the image textures. Now you can manually add them all in and plug them all up, but there is actually a feature of the Node Wrangler add-on which will add in all the textures for us. So with the principled shader selected and with the Node Wrangler add-on turned on, I can press Ctrl-Shift-T. And when you do that, Blender's file browser will come up, and then we can just select all the image textures. So just go into the folder where you have all the image textures, and I'm just going to click and drag and select all of the image textures. So we have the normal, the roughness, the color, and the metallic. And it is really important that these textures have those in the names, because the principled shader is actually going to look at the names, and it's going to use the names in the image textures to properly set up the material. So I can now just click on principled texture setup. And you can see that Blender has automatically set up all the texture maps for us. So it's added these mapping nodes right here, and it's using the UVs, and that's just telling the material that it's going to use the UV mapping. And then that is being plugged into all the textures. And then also something to notice is that the base color is set to sRGB because it is going into the base color, but the metallic, the roughness, and the normal are all set to non-color on the color space because they are not directly contributing to the base color. And And then also to convert the normal map into normal data, the node wrangler has also added the normal map node, and it's plugged that up correctly. And then also for some reason, if I control shift and select this, for some reason it added in the normal map into the metallic. So real quick, I'm just going to manually change this. So I'm just going to click on the file icon here, and then I'm just going to select the metallic texture and click on open image. And then I just want to set the color space here to non-color, and then I can control shift and select the principled shader. And so that is now correct. So now this is a baked texture, but it looks just like the procedural material that I created. And now that the textures have been properly baked, you could use this material in another 3D software, or you could upload it to Sketchfab or use it in a game engine. So that is it. That is how you do texture baking in Blender. And if you'd like to learn more about texture baking in Blender, then definitely check out my Blender texture baking tutorial playlist with the link in the description. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel to help me keep on creating Blender tutorials and Blender content, then I will have the links in the description to my Gumroad store and my Patreon page and the YouTube memberships. And I do appreciate your support. But I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and thank you for watching.